This is the Lou Rockwell Show.
Well, so great to have Peter Schiff with us today. Peter is the president of Euro-Pacific Capital, much better known as the great spokesman on American television and really American public life for Austrian economics, especially during this crisis. The man who has been telling the truth for so many years, who was not taken seriously enough in the past. Now I hope they're taking him seriously. But Peter, one thing I wanted to talk to you about today, we're having deflation, or at least we're having deflation hysteria. If we have deflation, isn't that really good for the consumer and for the saver? Aren't we seeing, in effect, the market wiping out the malinvestments of the boom, no matter what Washington, D.C. tries to do?
Sure. I mean, whenever you have an inflationary boom, it's going to be followed by a deflationary bust. But the problem is the governments don't like deflation. The government is the world's biggest debtor. Obviously, if money becomes more valuable, it makes its debts harder to repay. But our whole economy, is based on overvalued assets and consumer spending. And our tax system, the government is going to collect much lower tax revenues in deflation than it would during inflation. So the government doesn't want this deflation to occur. It's going to occur despite what the government wants, but it's going to be a deflation, of course, in terms of real money, which is gold. So prices are going to continue to fall for assets and consumer goods when priced in legitimate money, which is gold. But when assets are priced in the fiat currency that we use, dollars, the government is going to create so much money, and it is creating so much money that it'll be hard to see the falling prices because they're actually going to be rising in terms of dollars. I think initially asset prices will continue to fall relative to goods prices. So you'll still see that. You'll see the price of a house or the value of a stock coming down more than a gallon of gas or a bushel of wheat, or certainly an ounce of gold. But at some point, it'll probably turn into runaway inflation, or even asset prices eventually stop falling in nominal terms and begin to rise. But I think when that happens, asset prices will fall even faster relative to goods prices or relative to the price of gold.
But right now, are they pushing on a string? And the famous thing was said about the 1930s in the Federal Reserve. I mean, aren't banks on the margin holding money in reserves and not lending it, and aren't businessmen on the margin not borrowing?
Well, they can't lend it because the banks are losing money. I mean, the money that the government is creating and giving to banks, the banks are simply using that to repair their bad balance sheets. This money is necessary to keep them solvent. They can't make new loans because they don't have the capital. They've already lost so much money on the loans they made in the past.
So how exactly does the government engineer the inflation? Unless and until there's a recovery, then of course all these loans are going to be made.
Well, they're probably going to end up, instead of giving the money to the banks, they're probably going to try to have more ways to give the money directly to American citizens so that they can spend it. But the politicians think that economic growth is a consequence of spending, which it's not. It's economic growth that makes spending possible. But if the government is simply going to print money and give it to Americans so they can go to the mall, you're just going to see prices go through the roof. And so we're going to spend a lot more money, but we're not going to buy a lot more stuff. We're just going to pay more money for things that we used to buy.
I can remember joking when I read Bernanke's famous anti-deflation and printing press speech when he became head of the Federal Reserve. I wonder if he's going to send at some point in a crisis every American a $10,000 check.
Well, who knows? I mean, that might be coming. You hear these people talking about that the housing, and they say, look, we need houses to be affordable. Yes, well, the way houses are affordable is to allow the price to come down. But everything the government is doing is they're trying to stop home prices from falling. Now, I heard somebody on television the other day saying that, well, since the government controls Fannie and Freddie, why not just reduce interest rates so that people can afford to buy homes? Well, why not just let the prices fall? And then they won't have to borrow so much money. And then the interest rates won't be a problem because there won't be as big a mortgage. But, just like, and the same thing with, like college tuitions. The government is saying that we need to keep the credit flowing so people can afford to borrow money and send their kids to college. Well, how about not let the credit flow, let college tuitions come down so that families can actually afford to pay it without going into debt?
Well, of course, one thing we know, if we take, for example, the college sector, that given the massive subsidization that's taken place since the GI Bill and it's gotten worse and worse, that there are too many colleges and universities, that they have too many students, and they have too many faculty. So don't they have to shrink? And this, of course, would be a good thing.
Of course. I mean, and most of the kids that go to school today, they get a liberal arts degree, they really don't learn any skills that helps them in the labor market. I mean, they simply acquire a diploma because everybody now kind of uses a college diploma as a screening mechanism for employment, but I don't see any real benefit to the individual from a college diploma. I mean, it's, for certain industries, yeah, certain things that they could learn. But in most cases, I think people would be just as well prepared for the workforce if they just went out of high school and got a job. But, we don't need to have government. I mean, the reason that college is so expensive is because government subsidizes it. The same thing with education, with healthcare. Anytime the government subsidizes an industry, it gets very expensive. And the beneficiaries of the subsidy are not the people who have to pay, but it's the establishment that's providing the service. So it's the educational establishment, it's the healthcare industry. They benefit from all these cheap loans, not the people who are loaded up with debt in order to buy the products.
Well, Peter, they're obviously getting frustrated. All these bailouts, the trillions of dollars of bailouts aren't doing what they hoped would do and reignite inflation and make everything go up again and bring back what they see as the good old days. What's your prediction as to what they're going to try next?
Well, the good old days were not good. People are still confusing the problems with the consequences. What is happening now? The collapse of our economy, the bankruptcy in the financials, the falling home prices, the stock market, people losing their jobs, Americans not spending. This is the consequence of the problem. The problem was that for years we borrowed money and spent it. We borrowed trillions of dollars from the rest of the world, and we blew the money on consumer goods. We confused consumption with economic growth. We confused asset price appreciation with legitimate wealth creation. So while our stocks and bonds were going up in price, we ignored the fact that our industrial base was disintegrating beneath our feet, that our infrastructure was being allowed to decay, that the whole time we thought we were getting wealthier, we were really getting poorer. And we were just spending ourselves into bankruptcy. And now that the bills are coming due and we can't pay the money back, this whole phony economy is toppling down around us. The whole service sector economy that we thought was so great was just a mirage. It only could exist so long as the world would subsidize it, so long as they would lend us money that we couldn't pay back. But that's coming to an end. And, what the politicians don't understand is that they need to allow the market to work. They need to allow this service sector economy to crumble, and they need to allow asset prices to fall and people to lose their jobs and companies to go bankrupt, because we need to reallocate these resources in a more productive fashion. Land, labor, and capital need to be allocated so that we can start producing stuff again, and Americans have to start saving money, which means we need higher interest rates, not lower interest rates, which means we need this recession desperately. But in trying to fight it off, they're just going to create a much bigger problem. What they're going to end up doing is create a currency crisis. They're going to destroy the value of our money, and it's going to be much worse than the recession that we would have had if they stayed out of the way, which, of course, if the government would have stayed out of the way in 2001 and 2002 and allowed the malinvestments from the NASDAQ bubble, which they also inflated, to be corrected, we would have had a much deeper recession in 01, 02, but we would not be in nearly the trouble we're in today.
And, Peter, aren't they just replaying the Hoover-Roosevelt playbook? Aren't they doing exactly what those guys did?
Yeah, and not only are they replaying it, but they don't think they are. The conventional wisdom is that the reason we had a depression was because Hoover didn't interfere in the market, that he foolishly let capitalism work, and that's why we had a depression, and that Roosevelt rode to the rescue with big government programs, and he got us out of it. When the reality of it was that if Hoover had allowed the market to function, there never would have been a Great Depression. There would have been a severe contraction, but it would have been over in a year or two, and we would have been recovering. Instead, Hoover ignored the good advice of the people who told him to let the markets work. Instead, he tried every gimmick under the sun to pump things back up, and he made things worse. And then when Roosevelt came in, he simply continued those policies only on a grander scale and exacerbated the Depression and made it last for the entire decade of the 1930s. We would have got out of the Depression much quicker had it not been for what the New Deal did. We got out of the Depression despite what Roosevelt did, not because of what he did.
And, of course, it'll be the same with Bush and Obama and Bernanke and Greenspan and the whole bunch of them.
Yeah, look, we're repeating the same mistakes. The problem is the country can't afford it this time. We can't afford the New Deal that Obama wants to give us, because when Hoover came in, when Hoover left office, the whole federal budget was about $4 billion. Roosevelt doubled the government, but when he doubled it, it went from $4 billion to $8 billion. We've got a $3 trillion budget now. The government is doing everything already. We have massive taxes and regulations that didn't exist back then. We have this whole welfare state, people on Social Security. Nobody was on these government payrolls back then. And, of course, back then we had a solid industrial economy. We didn't have this phony service sector economy. We didn't have these huge trade and current account deficits that we have now. We had a much higher savings rate, and we were still on a gold standard. I mean, there was some discipline. There's none anymore. I mean, we can just the Fed can print and print and print, and that's exactly what Bernanke said. In fact, Bernanke is convinced that the reason we had a depression is because the Fed didn't print enough money. And if they just printed enough money, that all that would have been avoided. So he doesn't think there's a problem that he can't solve with his printing press.
But, of course, they can't.